They read the expulsion order on a Tuesday. I know that because I wrote it down in my field log that night, in the cramped suite the commission had assigned our delegation. A suite on the building's north face, deliberately, so we could not see the harbor or the transit yards, so we would look out each morning onto the maintenance scaffolding and the gray utility channels of the administrative quarter. They had chosen the room with the same precise small contempt they brought to everything else. I made a note. Tuesday, the 44th session of the Joint Treaty Commission of the Cedral Compact. Agenda Item 9. Earth's membership status, reviewed and resolved. What they resolved was this. Earth would be stricken from the Compact's recognized roster. Our archive entry, the formal record of our treaties, our contribution history, our recognized territorial claims, would be corrected. That was their word, corrected. As though our presence in the record had been an error, a clerical oversight that their long-suffering secretariat had finally gotten around to fixing. I sat at the far end of the table and let them read every clause. There were 22 delegates that session, 14 member species with full voting rights, 4 observer species with procedural standing, and 4 human representatives, including myself. The chamber ran in a wide horseshoe, tiered so that the senior delegates sat elevated at the curve while we, the junior parties, the probationary members, the species still working toward full standing, sat in the flat at the opening of the shoe. That architecture was not accidental. You were meant to look up at the ones deciding your fate. High Arbiter Solène Darvith Cass called the item with the particular tone she reserved for administrative housekeeping. The mild flat voice that said this matter is already settled, we are only recording it now. She was a tall creature, gray-silver and elongated in the way of her kind. Her ceremonial collar spreading wide from her clavicles in the cedral fashion, her eyes, large and pale, moved across the chamber the way water moves across a smooth surface, evenly, touching everything without pressing on anything. Item 9, she said. A review motion brought before this commission, under Article 47, subsection 3, of the Founding Accord. The matter concerns Earth's standing as a recognized territorial entity within the Cedral Compact's membership roster. Our lead counsel, a man named Brickard, started to rise. I put my hand flat on the table. He looked at me. I shook my head once, very small. Brickard sat back down. Darvith Cass continued. She described the motion in the droning procedural cadence the commission had perfected over 2 centuries of use. The language that made expulsion sound like reorganization, like tidying a drawer. Earth had not fulfilled the contribution obligations of its provisional membership. Earth's registered territorial claims exceeded what could be verified by compact cartographic survey. Earth's diplomatic representation had been, in the Commission's assessment, inadequately consistent with the norms of compact participation. That last one was my favorite. Inadequately consistent. What it meant was that we had, in the preceding 11 years, declined to ratify 3 treaty addenda that would have required us to route our deep-range transit traffic through compact licensed relay stations at a toll we considered and documented in writing in formal session to be set at 4 times the operational cost. We had said no. We had documented the reasons. We had offered alternatives. They had not liked being told no, and now the commission was calling our no inadequately consistent with norms. The vote ran around the horseshoe. 14 voting delegates. 13 voted in favor of the motion. The 14th, a gray-furred elder from the Mossian adjacency named Thurek Vol, voted against, and I noticed that he did not look up from the table when the tally was announced. He sat with his broad hands folded on the surface, and his gaze pointed somewhere below the proceedings, absorbing a loss he had known was coming. I had never spoken to Thurek Vol. I did not know what had moved him to vote as he did. He was not allied with Earth in any formal sense. He was, as best I could read an alien face in a single observation, a creature with a principled objection to a proceeding he considered improper, who had registered that objection in the only venue available to him, and it had made no difference. The commission secretary read the formal disposition. Earth was hereby removed from the compact roster. Our archive entry would be updated to reflect terminated status. Our provisional territorial claims would revert to the compact's unassigned survey pool. We would be permitted to withdraw our delegation at our convenience, but we would no longer hold standing to address the commission in any capacity. If Earth chose, at some future date, to reapply for provisional membership, we could submit a new application through the standard intake process. Standard intake, as though we were applying for the first time. As though the 11 years of provisionals, the 12 treaties we had co-signed, the navigational data we had contributed to the Compact's shared survey, the 2 conflicts we had helped mediate from the observer's bench, as though none of it had existed. Corrected. That was all. Darvith Cass set her notes down and looked at me with the polite expectation of a host who has just told a guest the evening is over. I stood up. Bricard and the other 2 members of our delegation stood with me. We gathered our materials. I took my time with it, methodical. Each folder stacked flat and squared, and we walked out of the chamber. No words, no raised voices. I did not look back at Darvith Koss, and I did not look at the 14 delegates in their tiered seats. And I did not look at the secretary, who was already annotating the record. We walked through the corridor, through the atrium with its cedral stonework, and its long banners listing the compact's founding species in gilded script, and out through the main doors into the gray morning. I wrote it down that night, Tuesday. Then I wrote one more thing, not in my field log. In a personal letter to the Director of Earth's Outer Affairs, marked private and encrypted, I wrote, "They have done us a considerable favor. They don't know it yet. But I want that on record now, before we begin, so that when we come back it will be clear that we knew. The Commission did not expect us to come back in any organized way. I understand that now, looking across 40 years at the decision they made in that chamber. They had assessed Earth the way you assess a liability, as a thing that costs more to maintain than it returns, a member whose refusals and counterproposals and documented objections had become an irritant. They had, I think, genuinely believed that removing us from the record would produce a kind of peace. The drawer would be tidy. Earth would recede. They had not done the arithmetic. In the first years, we let them have their silence. Our delegation returned home. I wrote my full report. And then, Outer Affairs did something that puzzled the Commission's monitors for about a decade before they stopped monitoring us closely enough to notice. We started talking to everybody the Commission had not bothered with. Not the Compact's great bodies. Not the anchor species or the senior voting delegates. The ones at the flat of the horseshoe. The ones who looked up at the tiered seats. The provisional members, the observer status species. The small navigational polities at the Compact's edges who had been told, year after year, that their concerns were under review. Their applications were in process. Their transit toll grievances would be addressed in the session and then the session. After that, there were more of them than the Commission had thought. That is the thing about an institution that faces inward. It stops seeing what is, accumulating at its margins. I ran the first 6 contact missions myself, 2 by long-haul transit, 2 by relay correspondence, 2 I conducted personally in borrowed berths on survey vessels. My title during this period was Senior Coordinator of Non-Compact Relations, which was a title Outer Affairs had invented because there was no existing category for what we were doing. We were building something that had no name yet, and we were building it deliberately in the blind spots of the institution that had corrected us out of existence. I should say that not everyone at Outer Affairs agreed with the approach. There was a contingent in those early years, senior people, experienced people, with honest concerns who believed that the correct response to the expulsion was to reapply for compact membership as quickly as possible, under better terms, from a stronger negotiating position. Their argument was that the compact was the dominant interstellar framework, that its network effects were too significant to build around, and that pursuing non-compact relationships was a second-best strategy that would leave us permanently at the margins. I thought they were wrong about the marginal part. I thought what they were actually describing was a strategy that would return us to the flat of the horseshoe, looking up. I did not say this in those terms, because it would have been unproductive. I said, instead, that we should develop the alternatives first, so that if and when we return to the compact, we return from a position of independent capacity rather than need. The Director of Outer Affairs agreed with that framing. We proceeded. The Mossian adjacency was first. Thuric Vol had voted against the motion. I did not contact him directly. That would have been too transparent, and he had enough difficulty within the compact's internal politics without adding the complication of an open correspondence with the expelled party. But I contacted his successor's office 4 years after his retirement and opened a quiet correspondence about transit mapping in the middle reaches. The adjacency had 3 corridors that the compact had chronically under-maintained. Complaints had been filed through commission channels for 12 years. The commission's response in each session was to note the complaints and defer action pending a full survey review that never materialized. We had survey vessels, and we had engineers who needed the hours. The correspondence took 8 months to become a working arrangement, and the working arrangement took 3 years to become a provisional treaty of mutual navigational support. In those 3 years, we surveyed all 3 corridors, identified the maintenance deficiencies, completed 2 of the corrections ourselves as part of the survey work, and filed a joint report with the adjacency's transit authority that was more thorough than anything the Commission had produced on the subject in a decade. The Commission noticed that treaty. It generated a procedural inquiry, asking whether Earth was operating transit infrastructure in compact adjacent space without compact authorization. We responded, through proper channels, that the Mossian adjacency was a compact provisional member, not compact territory, and that navigational support agreements between provisional members and non-roster parties fell outside the compact's exclusive jurisdiction under Article 12. We cited the article and the relevant subsection and included the Commission's own interpretive ruling from 11 years prior. In a case involving the Yanthari Cooperative, the inquiry was shelved. We noted the shelf date in our records. That was the first time we used the Commission's own procedures to hold a line, and it would not be the last. We kept working. The Yanthari were next, then the two scattered polities of the Driva Belt, then a loose affiliation of deep-range traders called the Harath Consortium, who had been trying to get compact observer status for 16 years and kept being told that their application needed supplementary documentation. We helped them compile the documentation. It was, in several respects, the most efficient thing I did in those years, not because the documentation was difficult, but because doing it taught us exactly how the compact's intake procedures worked and exactly which clauses were routinely wielded as delay mechanisms rather than genuine requirements. The consortium's application was 1,700 pages when we finished with it. I reviewed the final draft myself on a long transit from the Driva Belt back to the relay station at Pemcross, sitting in the cargo section of a survey hauler with a cup of bad coffee and a data pad, going through the cross-references. It was thorough. It was airtight. It cited every compact standard and met or exceeded every threshold. It was, in a technical sense, an unanswerable application. The Commission found an answer anyway. They required a third-party certification of the consortium's navigational charts from a recognized compact survey authority at the consortium's expense before the application could advance. The recognized compact survey authorities charged fees the consortium could not sustain without taking on partners, and the partners available to them were all inside the compact, which made them reluctant to antagonize the Commission by associating with an applicant the Commission had been dragging for 16 years. I submitted a counter-proposal on the consortium's behalf that the Joint Terran-Mossian Navigational Survey constituted a recognized technical survey for purposes of transit chart certification, given that it had been conducted to the compact's own stated survey standards and filed with the Commission's cartographic registry. The proposal cited the relevant compact standards document, which contained no exclusion of non-compact surveyors. The Commission spent 4 months deliberating. They accepted the proposal. The Harath Consortium's application was certified. They were admitted to observer status in the compact's 48th session, 20 years after they first applied. Not every contact mission worked cleanly. In the 9th year, we opened an approach to a navigational polity in the Deep Belt called the Trevani. Keepers, a small species, cautious by temperament, who controlled 3 relay points the compact had been trying to acquire for decades. The Keepers had refused the compact's overtures because they did not trust hegemonic structures, and we approached them, reasonably enough, on the premise that we were not a hegemonic structure and were not interested in becoming one. The approach ran for 2 years. We built a working relationship with their senior transit coordinator, a meticulous official named Hara Sethan, who cross-checked everything we told her against her own records and was satisfied eventually that we were telling her the truth. We drafted a preliminary agreement. We believed the agreement would be signed. Then the compact made the Keepers a new offer. Not better than ours in practical terms, but packaged with a commission seat, observer status, the thing the Keepers had always nominally refused but had, it turned out, always wanted. Hara Sethan sent us a formal letter explaining the change and expressing regret at the outcome and reiterating her belief that we had dealt with her honestly. The letter was courteous and final. We did not get the Trevani Keepers. I made a note of it in the contact mission file and closed the file. That is the kind of setback you absorb in this work, not a catastrophe, not a betrayal. An institution with more resources used its resources. We kept building from what we had. The Keepers joined the compact's observer tier, and within 4 years, Hara Sethan had filed the first of what became a series of formal complaints about observer tier treatment. And within 8 years, the Keepers were publicly advocating for observer tier reform from inside the Commission's chambers. I do not know whether that outcome would have been different if they had joined our compact instead. I know it was not a comfortable membership for them, and I know that the discomfort eventually produced a useful kind of pressure from inside the institution, which was not what the Commission had intended when they made the offer. The work continued regardless. We started using what we had learned, not as leverage, nothing so blunt, we shared it. Species that had been circling the compact's intake process for a decade found, suddenly, that someone was walking them through the procedural maze with a map. Some of them made it inside the compact. Some of them decided, having seen the map, that they did not want to be inside the compact at all. Either way, they remembered who had helped them. I want to be careful here, because this story is sometimes told as though it were a scheme. It was not a scheme. We were not building against the compact. We were building because we had been told we had no standing. And that instruction had turned out to be instructive in ways the Commission never intended. When you tell a species, with our particular character, that they have no standing, you are telling them to find another table. And we are very good at building tables. By the 15th year, we had something that Outer Affairs was calling, internally, the Terran Mutual Compact, 12 parties, 7 treaties of transit support, 3 navigational data sharing agreements. A common survey standard that 4 of the 12 had voluntarily adopted, because it was simpler and more accurate than the one the Cedral Compact used. No hierarchy, no tiered horseshoe seating, no provisional status. Membership was full and equal, or it was nothing. That principle had not come from a philosophical discussion. It had come from the 44th session of the Joint Treaty Commission, from the memory of what it felt like to sit at the flat of the horseshoe looking up. We had also, by the 15th year, begun the infrastructure. I have to say something about the infrastructure, because this is the part that tends to produce silence in a room when I describe it. Not the treaties, not the diplomatic groundwork, not the carefully documented correspondence. The infrastructure. Earth had been building ships for a long time. We had been building them before first contact, in the old tradition of sending probes into the dark because the dark seemed worth investigating. After contact, after we understood what was out there and how large it was, and how much of it was controlled or claimed or simply ignored by species who had arrived before us and drawn their lines, we had built differently. Still not for war. That is the thing I need people to understand about those decades. We were not arming for a conflict. We were building for the same reason we have always built. Because the space was there, because standing still in it had never been in our nature. The ships we built after the expulsion were survey ships and transit ships and engineering platforms. We built long-range relay stations and modular medical facilities, and the deep-range communications arrays that had been on Outer Affairs planning documents since before my time in the service. None of it was secret. We filed the construction notices with the relevant navigational registries, including the Compact's registry, because we were required to do so for transit safety reasons. The Compact acknowledged the filings and logged them and did nothing further. I think they expected the filings to thin out. I think they expected that without Compact membership, without the Compact's transit network and the Compact's resources, we would build less and less until we stopped building entirely. That is what happened to most expelled parties. They lacked the infrastructure to sustain independent operation and gradually contracted back toward their home systems until they were a local polity rather than a galactic one. We did not contract. By the 22nd year, we had 17 deep-range transit hubs in operation, 12 in human-administered space, 5 in space jointly administered under the Terran Mutual Compact's shared infrastructure protocols. They were not military installations, they were waypoints, survey depots, medical relay stations, long-range communication arrays. The things you build when you are serious about being present somewhere for a long time. The Commission noticed the hubs in the 22nd year. They generated a formal request under Compact security protocols asking Earth to submit documentation of the hub's operational mandate, their staffing, and their strategic positioning relative to established Compact transit lanes. We responded that the hubs were civilian infrastructure operating in non-Compact space under the Terran Mutual Compact's protocols. That documentation was available to any party that signed a standard mutual transparency agreement with us, and that we would be happy to discuss the security inquiry further at a meeting of our choosing. The Commission did not call a meeting. They sent 3 more procedural letters over the following year, each one more specifically worded, asking about the total mass displacement, capacity of the facilities, the range and resolution of the communications arrays, the maintenance schedules of the transit hubs, and whether they were capable of accommodating vessels larger than civilian survey class. We answered each letter with the precision it deserved and with a standing offer to meet. The thing about demanding detailed documentation of infrastructure you have no jurisdiction over is that it creates a record of your concerns without producing any remedy. Each of those letters went into our files. Each of our replies, complete, accurate, attached with technical specifications, offering the meeting they would not take, went into our files. The record was clear. The Commission had been given every piece of information we held, and it had produced neither the meeting nor the acknowledgement that the information was sufficient. The letters stopped in the 24th year and were not replaced. There was one harder moment in the building years that I want to describe, because it changed how we thought about what we were doing, and because Tesler was part of it, and she was still a junior coordinator at the time, years before she led the Vela session. Still, in the phase where you are learning whether you will break under the specific pressures of this work, it was the 28th year. We were in the process of designating the Harith-PEM corridor, the transit lane between the Harith Consortium's primary hub and the PEM Cross relay station, as a protected Terran mutual compact corridor under our shared infrastructure protocols. The designation would give the corridor formal status in interstellar navigational records, which meant any vessel transiting it would operate under our compact's rules, rather than the ad hoc arrangements that had been governing traffic there since the corridor was first mapped. The compact filed an objection with the relevant navigational registry. Their position was that the corridor ran through space that was under review for potential compact survey designation, and that formal corridor status should therefore be deferred until the compact's survey review was complete. The review, when we checked, had been opened 11 years prior and had produced no findings. We responded that the corridor had been in active use for 7 years under our protocols, that no survey designation had been filed in the intervening 11 years, and that the compact's objection did not constitute a competing claim under the registry's standards. We cited the registry's own resolution procedures and requested a determination. The registry referred the objection for mediation. Mediation was handled by a body the compact had significant influence with, and the initial mediating panel came back with a recommendation to defer the corridor designation for 3 years, pending the compact's survey completion, with the option of extension at the compact's request. Tesla drafted our response to that recommendation. I read the draft. It was 40 pages long, not because 40 pages were necessary, but because 40 pages were required to be complete, and she had been thorough in a way that closed every door the mediating panel might try to use. She cited 15 precedents. She attached an affidavit from the Harith Consortium's senior transit coordinator, attesting to the corridor's operational history. She included a timeline showing that the compact's survey review had been opened, extended, reopened, and extended again without producing any substantive findings, and noting the precise dates of each extension alongside the dates of our compact's documented transit activity in the same space. She submitted it on the 45th day of the mediation period. The mediating panel had not expected a response that length. They took 2 months to review it. At the end of those 2 months, they issued a revised recommendation. The corridor designation would proceed. The compact's survey review, if completed within 1 year, would be given consideration in determining any future competing claims, but could not retroactively affect a designation already in force. The compact did not complete the survey review within the year. They did not file a competing claim. The corridor was designated. I called Tesla after the decision came through. She was at the relay station at PEM Cross, handling a routine transit coordination matter. I told her the panel had ruled in our favor. There was a pause, and then she said, the affidavit was the one I wasn't sure about, whether it was admissible. I told her it had been the decisive element. She said good, and then she went back to the transit coordination matter. That is the quality I am trying to describe, not drama, not triumph. Just the assessment that a decision that needed to go right had gone right, noted, filed, and returned to work. The letters stopped in the 24th year and were not replaced, and the corridor was designated in the 29th, and the compact kept building. And by the 35th year, we had 21 member parties, and 36 treaty instruments, and 26 facilities, and the count kept climbing. I had retired from active fieldwork by then. My knees were finished, and my hearing in my left ear was not what it had once been. And the director of outer affairs told me, with the particular diplomatic honesty that comes from having worked closely with someone for 2 decades, that my value to the operation at this stage was in training the people who would do what I had done, not in doing it myself. I had opinions about that assessment. I kept them to myself. I ran the academy instead. We called it the Terran Diplomatic Corps Academy, which was a name that sounded grander than the building, converted survey station administration block on the eastern seaboard, 3 floors, aging climate systems, a view of a gray sea that was beautiful in February and brutal in July. My office was on the 2nd floor, facing the water, with a desk I had brought from my last field assignment and a shelf that held, among other things, my original field log from the 44th session, 11 years of prior work plus the single entry from the day of the vote. I kept it there because it was useful to have. Not as a reminder of grievance, I had worked too long to nurse grievance, but as calibration. This is where we started. This is what the record looked like, before we built what came after. I ran the academy for 9 years and graduated 4 cohorts, and the thing I told every class in their first week was this: you will spend your career in rooms where the architecture is designed to remind you that you are small. Your job is not to argue with the architecture. Your job is to know, with more certainty than the people in the tiered seats, What you have built outside, that is composure, not the performance of it, not a mask over anger or fear. The real thing, the steadiness that comes from knowing the count. I taught them the procedures. Not just Earth's procedures, the Compact's procedures, the Harith Consortium's procedures, the Mossian Adjacency's procedural customs, the Yenthori's dispute resolution protocols. I required every student to spend 3 months in the archives reading the Compact's session records, from the founding forward, because the Compact's history contained everything you needed to know about how an institution aged, where its rigidities had formed, and why, which of its procedures had been written to solve genuine problems, and which had been written to preserve the power of whoever was writing. Understanding that architecture did not require you to accept it. It required you to know it better than the people inside it. The 3-month archive requirement was not popular. Students arrived expecting field placement and strategy seminars, and I started them in a reading room. Going through session transcripts from the Compact's early decades, there was always, in the first 2 weeks, a particular quality of restlessness in the cohort, the feeling that this was not the real work, that the real work was somewhere else and they were being kept from it. I did not explain myself until the end of the 3rd month, when I asked them to describe, from the transcripts, the pattern by which the Compact's founding voting protocols had shifted over the first 50 years to give senior members a de facto veto without formally amending the accord. By then they had seen the evidence themselves, and they could trace the mechanism precisely. They understood from that exercise that the most consequential procedural changes in a body's history are usually the ones that do not appear in the formal record as procedural changes at all. That is what I wanted them to carry, not cynicism, precision, the ability to read a procedure and see not just what it says but what it does, and who it protects, and under what circumstances it can be turned. I also taught them the count. The number of parties in the Terran Mutual Compact, updated each year, the number of treaty instruments, the number of facilities, the number of corridors mapped, the number of species that had been helped through the Compact's intake process by our own Compact, and how many had subsequently chosen us instead. I required them to know those numbers the way a navigator knows the position of fixed stars, not to recite them, but because they are the background against which everything else is oriented. My 3rd cohort produced a woman named Mira Tesler, who became, 17 years after her graduation, the lead delegate on the mission I want to describe. She had come to the academy after a decade in survey administration, a precise and unflappable person who handled procedural complexity the way a good surgeon handles difficult tissue, without drama, without hesitation, and without wasting emotion. She was not an idealist. She did not talk about justice or vindication. She talked about instrument scope, about what a given procedure could and could not accomplish, about the difference between what a document said and what it was assumed to say. Those are different things more often than most people realize, and Tesler had built her entire career on that gap. My 5th cohort produced a man named Alexander Voss, who served as 2nd delegate. Voss had been a documentary researcher before the Corps, which meant he had spent years building evidentiary records from partial and contested sources. He had a researcher's particular understanding of what a document actually proves versus what it merely asserts, and an unlimited patience for going back to primary sources when secondary ones were being used to smooth over a contradiction. Neither of them had been alive when the Commission voted to correct our archive entry. They knew the vote the way you know a founding document. Something that happened before your life began, the document that made the world you were born into. I want to say something about that, about what it means to hand a thing forward across decades to people who did not carry it. We spend a great deal of time, in the aftermath of a wrong done to a generation, worrying about whether the next generation will understand the weight of it. In my experience, the ones who were given real work to do understood it fine, not as a grievance, as a fact, as the stone in the foundation that you account for when you build. Tesler and Voss understood. It was in the 39th year after the Commission vote that we issued the summons. I want to use the precise word, summons. Not an invitation, not a request for dialogue. A summons framed in the formal language of the Cedral Compact's own treaty protocols, under a clause that the Commission had not invoked since its founding, because no one had been in a position to use it. Article 61 of the Founding Accord. The Compact's own architects had written it in as a safeguard against the possibility of a member being wrongfully expunged. It required that any party that could demonstrate material prejudice from an expulsion proceeding, specifically, prejudice arising from a falsified or materially incomplete archive entry used to justify the expulsion, had the right to call a review session at a neutral venue of its choosing, with the Commission compelled to attend. We had known about Article 61 since the 21st year, when a junior researcher in our archive division had found it, while compiling a full procedural index of the compact's founding instruments. She had flagged it in a note included in a routine quarterly report to Outer Affairs, and the director had sent it to me with 2 words written at the bottom in his own hand: "Not yet." We had been patient with it for 18 years after that. The falsification was not subtle. It never had been. The Commission had, in the record of the 44th session, recorded Earth's provisional territorial claims as unverifiable, and had then, in the archive entry that justified the expulsion, listed those same claims as having never been submitted for verification. Those are 2 different statements. Unverifiable means the verification process was attempted and failed. Never submitted means the process was never started. The first could be honest incompetence or legitimate dispute. The second was a lie, and we had the submission records, time-stamped, sequenced, cross-referenced against the Commission's own intake logs, to prove it. We had held those records for 39 years. They were not difficult to maintain. They were data files. We kept them in 3 separate archive locations with rotating verification checks, and we kept printed hard copies in a climate-controlled storage room at the Academy, because I had learned, over a long career, that institutional memories are fragile and physical records have a stubborn quality that data does not always match. I had checked on those records personally once a year, every year for the 9 years I ran the Academy, and after I left the Academy, I had checked on them when I visited, which was often enough. First, Tesler delivered the summons in person to the Commission's current High Arbiter, a Caedrel, younger than Solène Darvith-Kaas had been, with the same elongated grace and the same wide pale eyes. Her name was Senna Darvith-Kaas. She received the summons in her outer office because she had not known what it was until Tesler placed the Exiled document on her desk. Then she read the heading and her hands went very still. Tesler told me later that the High Arbiter had looked up from the document and said, in a voice that was careful in the way a person's voice is careful when they are deciding not to reveal that they are alarmed, "This article has never been invoked." Tesler had said no. That was the complete reply, 1 word. We had not spent 40 years building a diplomatic tradition in order to lose composure in the High Arbiter's outer office. The summons required the Commission to attend within 60 days. They arrived on the 59th. The neutral venue we had chosen was Vela Station. That choice was deliberate. Vela was a joint facility, built on the Terran Mutual Compact's infrastructure, administered under our shared protocols, positioned at the convergence of 4 transit corridors that did not appear on the Caedrel Compact's official charts because 3 of them had been mapped after our expulsion and the 4th had been remapped after we demonstrated that the Compact's original survey contained an error. Every delegate who came to Vela Station arrived through infrastructure that we had built. The Commission sent its full delegation. 9 senior delegates, including the High Arbiter. 2 of them I recognized from the 44th session, older now as I was, wearing the years and the slight heaviness that accumulates at the joints. They were escorted from the transit bay by Voss, who was impeccably formal with them, who made sure they were housed well and fed correctly and given every consideration their status warranted. This was not kindness, or not only kindness, it was the articulation, in conduct, of a principle. We knew how to receive a delegation. We had never forgotten how. It was the Commission that had forgotten things, and we were here to remind them. I attended as an observer. Outer Affairs had offered me a formal role, and I had declined it. Tesler and Voss did not need me at the table, and I was better used where I have always been better used, watching the room. The chamber at Vela was not a horseshoe. It was a round table, flat and equal, with no elevated tier and no position of explicit precedence. The Commission's delegation took their seats across from ours, and I watched the High Arbiter take in the room. I watched her notice that there was no tiered seating. I watched her notice the flag at the chamber's head, not the Caedrel Compact's banner, not Earth's flag alone, but the Terran Mutual Compact's seal, a design we had settled on in the 28th year, 23 member parties contributing elements to it. I watched her count the seats around the table. The Commission had sent 9 delegates. We had brought 14. Not because the numbers needed to impress anyone. They didn't. The 14 delegates represented 12 member species of the Terran Mutual Compact, and each one was there because their species had a stake in the outcome. The Mossian adjacency was there. The Harath Consortium was there. 3 of the small navigational polities from the Driva Belt were there. They were not our subordinates or our clients. They were parties to a compact that had treated them as equals from the first day. And they had chosen to be present because this procedure concerned the compact they had helped build. The High Arbiter took all of that in. I give her credit. She did not allow herself to be visibly shaken. She arranged her materials and she waited. Tesler opened the session with the procedural citation, Article 61, the grounds for review, the formal demand for correction of the record. She did it efficiently. No flourish. 2 minutes of citation, and then she placed the first document package on the table. The complete intake submission records from Earth's 43rd and 44th session interactions with the Commission, cross-referenced against the Commission's own archived intake logs. She slid it across the table. Then she placed the second package, the archive entry as it appeared in the Commission's current record, with the falsified statement marked. She slid that across too. Then she placed the third, a complete census of the Terran Mutual Compact as it stood on the date of the session. Member parties, 23. Treaty instruments in force, 41. Shared infrastructure facilities in operation, 31. Transit corridors mapped and maintained under Compact protocols, 19. Recognized territorial claims filed and verified under Compact mutual recognition procedures, comprehensive. She placed it on the table and she left it there. No speech, no elaboration. That was the entirety of our opening. The session that followed ran for 3 days, and then 2 more behind closed doors, and then the signing. I will not describe every hour of it. What I want to describe is what the Commission's delegation did with those first 3 days, because it tells you something about institutions, and what happens to them when the thing they discarded comes back with a ledger. On the first day, they challenged the procedural validity of Article 61's invocation. They argued that the article required demonstration of active material prejudice, not historical prejudice, that because Earth was no longer seeking Compact membership, there was no ongoing injury to remedy. Tesler let them make the argument in full. Then she cited 3 prior Compact rulings, all of which held that historical prejudice from a falsified record constituted standing under Article 61, regardless of the party's current membership status. She had the rulings indexed. She had the page numbers. She had, I think, been carrying those page numbers in her memory for approximately a decade. The way you carry something that is both a tool and a point of personal satisfaction. I watched the High Arbiter's face while Tesler cited the third ruling. It was the face of a person who has just understood that a defense they prepared carefully is not going to hold, and who is simultaneously processing that fact and deciding how to proceed. That is a recognizable expression in diplomatic work. I had worn it myself. The professional response is to absorb the information and redirect. And Darvith Koss was a professional. The procedural challenge was set aside by the Commission's own rules, which they had no clean way to dispute from inside their own chamber. On the second day, they shifted. They did not abandon the challenge to the record. They tried to reframe it as an interpretive difference rather than a falsification. The statement in question, the one distinguishing between unverifiable and never submitted, was, they argued, a matter of how the intake process had been documented at the time, and documentary practices in the 44th session period had not carried the precision that later standards required. Voss handled this one. He produced, with the precision of a man who has spent years ensuring that documents say exactly what they mean, the Commission's own procedural manual from the period in question, which defined both terms with specificity, which drew exactly the distinction Tesler had cited, and which was still in force at the time the archive entry had been written. The manual had been authored by the Commission's own Secretariat. It had been in continuous use for 60 years before the 44th session. It was not a later standard being applied retroactively. Voss set the manual on the table alongside the relevant page, open. He did not explain it further. He returned to his seat, the Commission's procedural expert, a compact figure with the layered exoskeletal plates of a species I had not encountered before, who had been meticulous and sharp in the first day's arguments, sat quietly for a long time after the manual was placed. I watched her read the page. I watched her read it again. She made a note and passed it to one of her colleagues, and the colleague read it, and they had a very quiet exchange that I could not hear from the observer's bench. Whatever was said in that exchange, the interpretive difference argument was not pursued after the lunch break. The second to date ended in procedural motion and counter-motion on secondary questions, each one more narrow than the last, each one addressed from the document record that Tesler and Voss had built over a decade of preparation. By evening, 3 of the Commission's 9 delegates had stopped taking notes. Not in defeat, exactly, more in the manner of people whose task has shifted from argumentation to assessment. They were reading the third document package, the census. I watched them come back to it multiple times through the afternoon's session, checking figures, cross-referencing the treaty instruments listed against their own knowledge of what the Compact's current treaty map looked like. I know what they were finding. The Terran Mutual Compact, by the date of that session, held more active transit agreements with non-Compact parties than the Cedral Compact itself did. We had not publicized that figure. We had not needed to. On the third day, the Commission's delegation was quiet in the way that parties become quiet when they have used their available arguments and found each one of them prepared for. The High Arbiter spoke in the morning session. She was measured, She acknowledged the procedural record. She did not concede falsification directly. I had not expected her to, not on the floor, but she asked, in the careful language of institutional face-saving, what outcome Earth was seeking from the review. Tesler told her, we wanted 3 things. First, the correction of the archive entry. The original intake submissions to be reinstated in the record, the falsified notation removed, the Commission's record reflecting accurately what had occurred. Second, formal acknowledgement of the review's outcome in the Commission's public proceedings log, so that the correction would be part of the permanent accessible record and not an internal administrative note. Third, the Terran Mutual Compact's formal registration as a recognized treaty organization in the Compact's multilateral relations database, not membership in the Compact, not any form of subordination to it, but recognition of our Compact's existence and standing in the broader record of interstellar political structures. 3 things: no demand for reparations, no demand for reinstatement, no demand for apologies or ceremonies or the symbolic gestures that institutions sometimes offer when they cannot offer the real thing. Telsra explained the thinking to me the night before, over tea in the station's small common area. I had told her the 3 demands would read as restrained, and some people would call it too restrained. She said the 3 demands would get everything that actually mattered. The archive correction was the foundation. The public log was the permanence. The multilateral recognition was the future. Everything else was theater, and we had not come here for theater. I had told her she would have been very good at this even if I had never taught her a thing. She had told me she doubted that, but she appreciated the professional evaluation. The Commission accepted the 3 demands. Not warmly, not swiftly. There were 2 more days of closed sessions, of consultation among their delegation, of the procedural choreography that institutions use when they are doing something they had not expected to do. The High Arbiter was professional through all of it. Whatever she had felt when she first read the summons in her outer office, she carried it internally in the way that you carry difficult things when you have no better option. I was not in the closed sessions. That was appropriate and expected. But Tesler told me what happened in them, the night before the signing, in the same common area where she had explained the 3 demands. The Commission's delegation had spent the first closed day attempting to negotiate the scope of the archive correction. They had wanted the correction to apply to the specific notation about the territorial submissions while leaving the broader expulsion record intact, a surgical amendment they called it. Tesler had declined. The correction applied to the entire entry, or it applied to nothing, because the falsified notation was not an isolated error but the stated basis for the expulsion, and a correction that left the expulsion record standing without its factual foundation would be a correction in name only. The Commission had pushed back. They had argued that a full correction implied a degree of institutional culpability that went beyond what Article 61 required. Tesler had agreed that it did and had noted that this was precisely what Article 61 required, and had pointed to the relevant language in the article. The second closed day had been quieter. The Commission's delegation had consulted among themselves for several hours and then returned to the table with a revised position. They would accept the full correction, but they wanted language in the public proceedings log describing the review as a procedural clarification rather than a finding of falsification. Tesler had said the public log would reflect the findings of the proceeding, which included the documentary evidence establishing that the archive entry did not accurately represent the events of the 44th session. She had not used the word falsification in that formulation. She had not needed to. The documentary evidence spoke clearly enough, and the public record would say what it said. The Commission had accepted that. After Tesler finished telling me this, I asked her if there had been any moment where she thought it might not hold. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, in the first closed session, when they proposed the surgical amendment, for about 30 seconds I wondered whether we had enough leverage to hold the full correction, or whether the wiser position was to take the partial and go home. I asked what had decided it for her. She said, the Harith Consortium delegate. I looked across at him, and I thought about the 16 years of standard intake, and I thought about the 40-page response to the mediating panel, and I thought, if we take the partial, that is the record. That is what we got for 40 years. That is not the record I want to hand forward. I did not say anything, she said, so I held the line. The correction was signed on the 7th day of the session. I need to say something about the moment the document came across the table. The Commission's secretary placed the signed correction notice in front of Tesler, and Tesler read it. I watched her eyes move across the page, and then she set it face down on the table and slid the document folder shut. That was it. No one exhaled dramatically. No one raised a hand. The Mossian delegate across the table sat with her hands folded. And I watched her eyes, and I thought about Thuric Vol, who had voted against on a Tuesday 40 years ago and gone to his retirement knowing he had lost, and I thought about the fact that the current Mossian delegate was Thuric Vol's granddaughter, and that she had been born 3 years after the expulsion, and that she was here because she had wanted to be here, and because the Terran Mutual Compact had a seat for her if she wanted it. Senna Darvithkas looked across the table at Tesla. There was a pause, the kind that carries content. That means something is being processed at a level below the procedural surface. She said, I want to ask you something, and I ask it outside the session record. Tesla said, go ahead. We looked at your Compact's treaty census, the High Arbiter said. The 41 instruments, the 31 facilities, the 19 corridors. She paused. This was not built in response to this session. Tesla said nothing. You built this before you invoked Article 61, Darvithkas said. It was not quite a question. We have been building since the 44th session, Tesla said. Another pause. How long? The High Arbiter asked. Before you called the review. Tesla looked at her for a moment, long enough to be certain of the outcome. Darvithkas was quiet for a beat. Then she said, I want to ask something else. Tesla waited. The Harith Consortium, the High Arbiter said. They filed for observer status in our commission 17 years ago, after gaining your recognition. They have filed 3 reform proposals in the observer tier since then. They cited your Compact's mutual recognition standards in all 3. She paused. Was that deliberate, on your part? Tesla said, we helped them compile their intake application 30 years ago. After that, they made their own choices. Darvithkas looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said, that is what I thought you would say. It was the most honest exchange in the session, I think. Precisely because nothing in it was contested. The High Arbiter was not accusing us of anything. She was taking the full measure of what had happened, and she was doing it accurately. And she was acknowledging, without saying so directly, that the Commission had not understood what it was creating when it expelled us. We had not set out to reform the Compact from outside. We had set out to build something that worked, for the species the Compact was not serving. What the Harath Consortium and the Trevani Keepers and the Mossian Adjacency and a dozen others had done with the example of that, how they had used their own standing inside and outside the Compact to press for the things they needed. That was their work, not ours. We had given them a model and a map. They had used them. Darvithkas could see that. She was a perceptive person in a difficult position, and she was doing the one useful thing available to her. She was understanding it correctly, so that she could carry the correct understanding back to the institution she led. I watched her stand, and I watched her gather her materials, and I thought, she will be better at this than her predecessor was, not because she is less capable, but because she has now seen what the Compact's expulsion policy produced when it was applied to a party with our particular character. She will apply that knowledge. The Commission will not do this again, not to us. We are beyond their reach now, but as a general practice. That is something. It is not everything, but it is something real. I watched Darvithkas take that in. She was, I thought, a more able diplomat than her predecessor. Not because Selene Darvithkas had lacked ability, but because this one had inherited a harder position and had navigated it without losing her composure. She would carry this session back to the Commission, and she would have to explain it, and she would explain it correctly, which is to say she would explain it in terms the Commission could hear. That Earth had used the Commission's own procedures against an error in the Commission's own record, and that the outcome was the minimum that Article 61 required. What she would not be able to fully explain, I thought, what would remain in the proceeding log as a set of numbers that anyone could read, but that would take time to fully absorb, was the scope of what we had built in the space the Commission had created for us by pushing us out. 23 member parties, 41 treaty instruments, 31 facilities, 19 corridors, and most of what the Commission had tried to fold back into the unassigned survey pool, the territorial claims they had called unverifiable, and then falsified into never submitted, had been quietly verified, documented, and co-recognized by the Terran Mutual Compact's member parties years ago. That work was done. The Commission could correct its archive entry, and the correction would be accurate, and the accuracy would record that Earth's position at the time of the expulsion had been, as we had stated it, and that the Commission's record had been wrong. But the correction would also record what Earth was now. And what Earth was now was, by any measure that mattered in practical interstellar politics, considerably larger than what the Commission had expunged. There is a particular kind of silence in a room when an institution realizes that a decision it made in confidence of its own dominance has produced an outcome that it did not model and cannot reverse. I had heard it before, in smaller rooms, in earlier years, but I had never heard it at that scale. I had never sat in a room where 22 parties from a dozen species were absorbing the same arithmetic simultaneously. I found myself thinking of a geological term, the moment when a structure that has been under load for a very long time makes the small internal adjustment that prevents the larger collapse. The room felt like that, not a crisis, an accommodation of a new reality. The High Arbiter signed the correction notice. Her 9 delegates countersigned where required. The session was formally closed, the records sealed and transmitted to the Compact's public archive. We filed out through Vela Station's main corridor, the Commission's delegation ahead of us by protocol, and I walked at the back of our group the way I had always preferred to walk. Not at the head, not at the center, but behind, where you can see the whole shape of a thing moving. I looked at the backs of 22 people from a dozen species walking out through a station that Earth had built, down a corridor that Earth had named, toward transit ships that would carry them through corridors that Earth and our Compact partners had mapped. I thought about a Tuesday 40 years ago, the horseshoe chamber, the archive being corrected. I thought about what Thuric Vol's granddaughter had said to me the evening before, over dinner in the station's common area. She was a compact, careful woman in her middle years, with her grandfather's habit of speaking slowly and meaning every word. She had said, with the directness I had come to expect from Mossians. My grandfather told me he voted against because he believed the motion was unjust. He regretted that his no could not stop it. He would have been glad to be here. I told her I thought he would. She asked me if it felt like vindication. I told her I would have to think about the word. Vindication carries a quality of surprise to it. The feeling that what was always true has been finally proven. But we had known it was true for 40 years. What this felt like was closer to completion. The thing was done. The record was accurate. The work had been finished by people who were good at it, and the institution that had created the wrong had corrected it under its own rules. That is what 40 years of work looks like when it lands. Not a shout, not a celebration in the corridor, a signed document, a sealed record, and a generation of diplomats who had been alive for none of the original injury, and all of the resolution walking out in good order through a station they had helped build. I wrote in the mission log that night, an old habit, the same one I had kept since the 44th session, and I wrote the date at the top of the entry, and below it I wrote, the record is corrected. The Compact stands. The work continues. That is the plainest version of what happened. I have been asked to tell it more elaborately, and I have tried, and I think the elaboration is useful, because the plain version makes it sound easier than it was. It was not easy. 40 years of sustained, patient, undramatic work is not easy in the way that a battle is not easy. It is difficult in a different register. The register where you must keep building on the days when building seems futile, where you must keep the count when no one is watching, where you must believe in the document and the data and the procedure, even when the institution using them against you has the power to make your no disappear from the record. It is also, and I say this having lived inside it for 4 decades, the kind of work that does not look like much from the outside until it is finished. From the outside, for the 20 years at the middle of it, it looked like a small expelled polity quietly doing survey work and signing minor navigational agreements. No one writes about quiet, patient construction while it is happening. The Compact's monitors stopped filing reports on us because there was nothing alarming to report. That indifference was its own kind of advantage, and we used it. There were years, in the middle of it, where I wondered whether the count was right. Not the numbers. I trusted the numbers. But whether the thing we were building would hold the weight we needed it to hold. When the weight finally came, institutions can be correct on paper and hollow in practice. Treaties can be technically valid and practically inert. I had seen both. The Terran Mutual Compact had been built carefully, but carefully built things can still fail. And I had spent enough years in the work to know that confidence and certainty are not the same thing. What I had not fully reckoned with, in those middle years, was the quality of the people coming up behind me. Tesler and Voss and their contemporaries did not share my uncertainty. Not because they were reckless. They were rigorous, precise, professionally demanding in the way that good diplomats must be. But they had grown up inside the Compact. It was their normal, not their achievement. They had not watched it being built. They had simply found themselves inside something solid and well-made, and had gone to work improving it. That is a different relationship to a thing than the one you have when you helped lay the first stones. It produces a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence of the person who has overcome doubt, but the confidence of the person who has no reason to doubt, because the thing has worked every time they have used it. I have been asked, more times than I can count now, what I said when I walked out of that chamber on a Tuesday 40 years ago. The answer is nothing. We gathered our materials and we walked out, and there was nothing to say that the walk itself did not say more clearly. And I have been asked what we said when we walked back in. What Tesla said was, "Here is the document. Here is the document that corrects the record. Here is the document that shows what we have built. I will leave these here. You can read them." That was it. I have thought about why that is enough, about why the brevity of it feels proportionate to the scale of it. I think it is because the documents were the argument. The 40 years were the argument. By the time Tesla placed those folders on the table, everything that needed to be said was already said. In treaty instruments, and survey coordinates, and the census of 23 parties who had chosen to be there. The room did not need us to explain it to them. They could do the arithmetic themselves. The commission session, log from the 44th year, now carries a correction notice in the standard format, cross-reference to the original expulsion record, noting that the archive entry for Earth's membership status has been amended to reflect accurate intake documentation. It is 3 paragraphs. It is exactly as bureaucratic as it sounds. It is in its bureaucratic precision, also exactly what it needs to be. And in the Terran Mutual Compact's own records, in the archive we maintain at Vela Station and at 12 other facilities across the member parties as space, there is a complete record of the 40-year period between the expulsion and the correction. The treaties, the corridors, the facilities, the cohorts of the academy, and the names of every person who served in them. The correspondence with Thurek Vol's successor's office. The procedural letters from the commission and our replies. The 3 demands we made and the 7 days it took to get them signed. And at the beginning of that record, dated to a Tuesday 40 years before the correction, there is a personal letter marked private and encrypted, the seal long since broken, addressed to the Director of Outer Affairs. They have done us a considerable favor. They don't know it yet. But I want that on record now, before we begin, so that when we come back it will be clear that we knew. We knew. We came back. The record is accurate now.